This is
what's the name again?
RedPubPod,
RedPubPod.
a podcast
RedPubPod.
from Red Hot Publications.
RedPubPod.
Say that 3 times fast.
Welcome to RedPubPod. My name is Richard Eller, and with me today is a man of many talents who I am very proud to have as part of our group today, and that is our editor extraordinaire. He's also a historian. He's also a poet. He's written on Catawba County history, baseball history, sometimes together, and many other things. Tim Peeler.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for being here. And maybe he's also serving as referee today because the other guest is my co-author in a new book that we have written, who also happens to be my wife, Claudia Ward.
Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going great.
Okay, if it gets ugly, Tim's going to intervene, okay?
All right.
The book that we're going to talk about is a new thing called Marcellus, the Thorntons of Harper House.
Now, the first thing I wanted to ask you about was how you sourced this material. Like, where did you find this story? And it's really an amazing story. As an editor, it probably kept me reading as much as anything that I've come across in a while.
Well, it kind of comes from the people who lived at Harper House, and I had done something previously on the Schulers, the guy who built it, and so I knew I wanted to move on to the second iteration of the house, and that was Marcellus Thornton. And I knew that he had done a couple of books, which I had read. I don't know that I could recommend them as reading material, but you know they're what they are. They're a novel of their time. And so I started researching him and began to find out all this incredible stuff about him, and just took it from there. The first one was the quail story, and then I sort of chronologically followed him. And unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot written about his wife, Elizabeth. So I kind of had to follow her where I could. And then Claudia and I began to discuss this thing, and she kept saying, well, where is she? And she's very much hidden. So when she came in on the project, she decided that there needed to be, as makes sense, right, more about her than I had at first gathered, right?
Right, because how many times are women voiceless when men speak for them?
I don't know. I'm going to try to be quiet as much as I can here today. But that's a 19th century, and honestly a 20th century thing, is that the husband, even though he may not be the real breadwinner of the family, he speaks for the family. And so there was all this stuff that came in from him, and she every now and then would appear. And so we had to develop that as far as we could, given what we knew.
And you might want to give the listeners a time frame
that
we're talking about.
Tell us about Elizabeth.
Well, Elizabeth was born on September 26th in 1828. So we're talking about the 1800s, Victorian age. So very, if you can imagine, traditional times, that's when we're really talking.
Yeah, and then he's born 1848, which is 20 years after her.
Right.
And that made them an unusual couple for the Victorian era. But she was pretty well-to-do, I mean, from what we know. And one of the ways we found this out is, again, going to the male in the family, finding out about her father.
Right. You can look up and find out that she's from Sackett's Harbor, New York. The family was fairly wealthy. They had a comfortable life with their family schooner business, so they shipped things back and forth, and so she had done pretty well, with the family.
Yeah, and we don't really know how she got to Arkansas for her first husband, but she does end up, and one of the things Claudia pointed out the other night when we did a presentation on this, about her not marrying until 30, which is another thing that goes against Victorian custom.
Right. She sort of blew that stereotype right up, because to be that old and living, she's in Arkansas, so she's far away from her family, and then she meets a man who was a widower. His wife had died, and their daughter, and then ultimately his other son dies, leaving one stepson, and they they married, and it was just a very fast wedding. But that is something that I, with doing research to try to find, where is this woman's voice? What would a woman be doing at that time? It was very common for people to remarry that quickly, particularly men, because they felt like they needed, somebody to help with the children. So that wasn't as odd as her not, marrying before.
It's out of the box. Mm-hmm. And then he dies within, 6 years of their marriage.
Right. And
she stays on to take care of Chester, the son, for a while, and then answers an ad.
And so she answers an ad. This is really kind of fun, for an elocutionist. And I just loved that term, looking up an elocutionist. Someone who could read to him and she answered the ad first of John Rutherford Jr., and he was actually a very wealthy and influential man. At one time, I believe, owned most of Burke County.
Everything from the western side of Morganton on, all of Bridgewater, and thousands of acres. But he'd never married until Elizabeth came along.
Right. And so he's 80 years old. He had 4 sisters who probably cared for him.
Fussed over him.
Yeah, had fussed over him, but he liked Elizabeth's style and her manner of delivery enough that they ended up marrying, and actually were married for 10 years. He lived to the age of 90, which is pretty amazing. And from all accounts, she had a good time with, being with John Rutherford.
But that speaks to your question about research. You almost have to find out about her by going through the men in her life.
Did you find anything that you might call a primary source for this, or was this all sourced from newspaper articles, databases?
Yes, it is mostly from there, because there's very few things of a primary source nature other than his handwritten copy for one of his novels. So we've got his own handwriting. And since he was a newspaper man, he would put little tidbits about himself in the paper, and other newspaper guys loved to write about him, because apparently, he was that kind of peacock sort of guy. And so when he would make a mistake, or he would give a bad speech or something, they all reported on him. So most of it came from that. Some of it came from hearsay, because there's this famous phrase that comes from Elizabeth. Now, we've gone through the first 2 marriages. What did she have to say about them?
The great thing about Elizabeth is she says, and I'm going to give the more polite version that is attributed to her. And she says, I married the first time for love, and so that would be with Orville Jennings, and I got it. And the second time for money, and I got it, and that would be with John Rutherford. And then she said, and the third time for nothing, and I got it.
So that's Marcellus.
Yes, referring to Marcellus. And you talk about a whirlwind marriage. She married him very quickly after meeting him, and like you had said earlier, he was 20 years her junior, which again is not your stereotypical Victorian
trophy husband.
Yeah, it was a trophy husband, exactly. And so that's why I just kept being so intrigued with this lady, and how strong and powerful to go so far away from New York, first of all, marry a man, and then answer a letter and take that and go, somewhere else, to come to North Carolina, and then she moved to D.C. To be with her sister, and that's where she met Marcellus. And you could talk about some of his fun things that were going on before he met her, and some of the escapades.
He's a Georgia boy, and was part of the Atlanta newspaper movement after the war. And so he was out there with Henry Grady and those guys. And he must have been the cub reporter that they all wanted to, see if we can do this. Yeah, go get Marcellus. He can do that. Because they one time challenged him to eat a quail a day for 30 days. And so he does. And the newspapers, and there's newspapers in Boston and Cincinnati that are reporting what what this quest is, because there was really only like a couple $100 worth, of a bet in it, but it took on a life of its own as kind of a celebrity event, even though he at that point wasn't a celebrity. But they fricasseed it and they barbecued it and they fried it and all this sort of stuff. And so at the end of the 30 days, everybody was wanting to know, did he eat one for 30 days? This was February and March of 1876, and he did. He actually ate two on the last day. One the second one to prove to the newspapers that he did it, because the first one happened out of sight and they didn't believe it. He had a hard time getting that one down. He supposedly had to go chew a little tobacco and swallow the juice to settle his stomach to make sure that he could finish it off. And so that sort of put him on the I guess you'd say minor celebrity map. He was at one time in both parties, Democratic, sometimes he's Republican, sometimes he was really an opportunist is what he was. But when he didn't get elected in Georgia and got into a few celebrated fights with people, he decided to go to D.C. and join the Garfield administration. Well, he met with President Garfield, but they didn't offer him much of a job. He was a clerk at the patent office when he met Elizabeth in that summer of 1881, and by September, they were married.
Yes, talk about a whirlwind wedding.
And then he began to use her money.
Yeah.
She had a lot of it. And so they came down to Atlanta and bought a couple newspapers, which he proceeded to ruin. He was going to create a newspaper empire, and he just, I don't think, was business-minded enough to be able to do that. And he had actually borrowed money from her.
And we don't want to give away everything, but it's quite fascinating to see how this woman, mostly unspoken, but how does she corral this man through their marriage? And she does. And in some ways that are fairly 21st century in handling them. And so, like I said, we don't want to give it all away, but it was fascinating enough for me to keep me intrigued and inspired to get this woman's story. And I'm so glad to be able to get part of it out. I think that makes, it's important to get words out.
And how did they end up in Hickory, North Carolina? I mean, to me, that's a pretty amazing story in itself.
And what's weird about it is always luck, always timing that makes some of these things happen. I mean, how would he be in D.C. at the same time she was, to get married in the first place? But after he sent a couple of those newspapers into ruin, they went to Kentucky and the border of Tennessee and Kentucky and bought a coal mine and ran it successfully for a couple of years until the DuPonts tried to oust them because one of the DuPonts had heard that there's money in coal mines and got him fired as the manager and her taken off the board of directors. And then not quite a year later, they ousted the DuPonts. And they made real serious money with this coal mine. And that's how they recouped all of the losses that he had made during the Atlanta newspaper days. But after that, when they sold the mine, they came back to John Rutherford's house over in Bridgewater. And I think they were planning to stay there until she found out about what we call the Harper House. It was the Schuler house at the time. And the Schulers were, Daniel had maybe died, maybe not. And the rest of the family had moved out, so the house was for sale. She liked it. She bought it. They moved there, and then he came in about a year or so later and took over the local newspaper, the Hickory Times, the Hickory Press and Carolinian, and gave him something to do, a newspaper to play with, and that's how they ended up in Hickory.
And that house is beautiful. If you haven't seen it, it's really worth going to see. It's a jewel. It's perched on a hill. And I can just imagine it being this jewel in a bed of green, all the pastures around it, as a turret room. And I mean, it's a very beautiful house. And I could see how someone would be swept away to want to move to it.
And at that time, it included a barn and horses and everything.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, it was really a spread.
Right. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Right.
And then she changed the architecture of it, did she not, based upon the relationship?
She did. It's quite interesting when you come to the Harper House, as it is called now, which I recommend. Please notice that there are 2 front doors, not just one. And there's some conjecture as to why would you want 2 front doors. That's not traditional. That's not normal.
It's not very Victorian either.
Right. It's kind of odd. But there's conjecture and thought that she was so tired of his shenanigans by then that she refused to let him come in the same door. So he had to come in the other door so she wouldn't have to look at his face every day.
Because we think she banished him to the downstairs area, and he had to use one door, and she lived upstairs. So to avoid him when she went out and went to town, she had another one placed at the front of the house so that she could exclusively use that and keep him away from her.
Yeah. And one thing we do know about her is that she was seen, the only description, we don't know how tall she was or what color her hair was, but that she had, I believe it was 2 white horses that she liked to ride in a carriage, and she was likened to Queen Victoria. So we don't know if that meant because she was regally waving or tiny. We don't know.
Yeah, that she physically resembled her, we don't know. Because again, she's very mysterious. You know, he's all over the place and giving his opinions and swearing that the town wants him to run for mayor and all this sort of stuff. But she is really a hidden figure. But she carries a lot of weight. I don't mean that physically, although that may, who knows, that may have been.
Right.
Yeah. He really kind of follows in the footsteps of the Schulers because Daniel Schuler had started the first electric company. And when he comes to town, he decides that Hickory needs to be electrified, and he takes it over, buys it, puts a power source out at the river, and runs it for a couple of years as Thornton Power and Light. And you know, again, we don't know how much of that business acumen that it took to do that is his and how much is hers. He was president of the company, but she was the secretary-treasurer. And what I've noticed in researching some other companies, that's the real power position because that's the one that holds all the purse strings. You know, a president can be a kind of a ceremonial job, but she knew how it worked, and they ran it until they sold it to what became Duke Power.
And it is interesting. There's a book, Abernathy Reminiscences, by Elizabeth Abernathy Irwin, a different Elizabeth, and her quote was, "It was his wife who held the purse strings and was considered to be a wealthy woman." One sentence, but says a lot.
So how did the people from Hickory react to Marcellus? What did they think about him?
I think he was largely accepted because Hickory was such an accepting town of newcomers. You know, it wasn't very clannish like other towns are. So I think they were willing to accept him on his own terms. Now, did they laugh at his bombast? Yeah, probably. He also got a reputation around town for being an inebriate because he liked to drink. And so that was in the era when Hickory was going back and forth between being a dry town and a wet town. And when it was dry, he would go to the drugstore and order tincture of ginger, I think it was, as a way to get his alcohol. Now, that's some harsh alcohol to drink, but that he gained a reputation for stumbling home, because that's one of the things Elizabeth Abernathy Irwin talks about is him walking by the house and, you know, him being kind of a wobbly sort of guy. And there is one story that Kleinert tells in his Kleinert Looks Back book that he asked him, he says, "Well, how do you get home?" And he says, "I just light my cigar and follow the light." So that's the way he tumbled home. But, you know, in his defense, he was a fairly prolific writer. He'd had one book that he'd written when he was in Atlanta called Sylvester Lester. And he made the mistake of making one of his characters a not so distant lookalike to a real person. And that real person came and threatened to beat him up. So we don't know whatever happened to that manuscript, if there even really was one. It never got published. But while he was in Hickory, he wrote My Buddy and I and The Lady from New Orleans. And My Buddy and I is about coal mining and a coal mine owner, which he was. So it gives us some kind of indication of what it was like to run a coal mine, because he tells some factual stuff about how the coal was extracted and how it was weighed and all this sort of stuff. So we get an idea that he knew enough about it to be able to write about it. Now, The Lady of New Orleans is a book about race, about the lady's racial background. And so, he's a little edgy there in that he's willing to talk about something that was pretty taboo around turn of the century. And these two were both written downstairs, we think, at the Harper House. And one was published in 1899 and the other was published in 1901.
Did he also have a book of poems? Am I remembering correctly?
He did. He kept calling it an epic. And in his later days, when he didn't have as much money, he needed funds to help him publish it. And I don't think that ever got published. And when he died, he was penniless, and a lot of that stuff got sold off. So somebody may have that, or it may have just gotten trashed because maybe nobody bought it. But yeah, he wrote. Because he would write letters to the editor at the paper, and that's another way that we get an understanding of just who he was at any given time. He did not hide his candle under a bushel, and so he was trying to get it published, but we don't think he ever did. Or if it was, it isn't under his name.
Yeah, I remember reading some poems in the manuscript, and I think they had been published in newspapers.
Yeah, little bits of ones, yes.
So there's probably no way to collect all of that into a volume at this point. Probably not enough of it out there.
Yeah, I think I found about 3 or 4 of them. And when Elizabeth passed, because she died before him, when she died, he wrote about her. And then just a couple other things. But yeah, he swore he had a whole lot more that we've never seen.
Would be interesting to read because he is a very interesting, very flamboyant character.
Yeah, and it's hard to know whether or not he was so flamboyant he just put people off, and they said, oh, there he goes writing again. There he goes portraying himself as an author again. And because neither of those books sold very well. But the amazing thing is they've stayed in print, or enough copies were made so that we have them now, 120 some years later.
Could you describe for the listeners what he looked like?
He was a dapper sort. Supposedly, he always walked with he was dressed up, and at the time it was one of those morning coats that was a cutaway, and he always had a cane, and he had a mustache and a goatee, and wore a top hat. And that's one of the ways that he was identified around town as something of a dandy. And he was always well kept. He was kind of a clothes horse. And those are really the way, that's the way that people around Hickory, what few that described him. Because one of the things said he looked like an old Southern gentleman. And that he was even in a parade in Charlotte one time where they were on a float where they were talking about the Old South. And since when he was a young man, he served in the Confederacy. His father was the guy who kept the defenses of Atlanta going. His father had directed his son to go around and procure food for the defenses, for the soldiers there. And that would be, make him 15 or 16, he was going around to the farms in Georgia outside of Atlanta and telling them they need to give him food, which they probably didn't. But he used that when he was here to talk about what a veteran of the war. And some people didn't believe him; they thought he was too young to have done that. So I think he felt he had a reputation to upkeep as editor, as author, as Civil War veteran, as owner of the power company. He's a lot like Daniel Schuler in that when he came to Hickory, he assumed a lot of roles.
Could you explain how he came to be called Colonel Thornton? I mean, and that whole tradition, which I think was very much alive right after the Civil War.
Yeah.
Seems like.
I can't really, because he just started calling himself that. A 16-year-old kid being a colonel there are stories in the Civil War about boy colonels, but he wasn't one of them. But after the war, he began to refer to himself as colonel. And, his political opponents would use that against him to say he ain't no colonel. But he used it long enough and vehemently enough to where the people just used that title for him. He liked it, apparently.
And apparently, from what I remember in your furniture book, there were a lot of the people that owned furniture companies who had similar titles who had been in the war.
Yes.
I remember that was pretty common.
Yeah, and most of those are legitimate, but we just don't think it is with Thornton. But he liked that term. Yeah. He was a guy in some ways very much of his time, but he was also occasionally ahead of his time because he was a lawyer by training, and apparently not a very good one, because when his father died accidentally on the railroad line, he botched his mother being able to get a decent settlement. But when he came up here, he partnered with legitimate Colonel Silly, who was from Minnesota, won the Congressional Medal of Honor, was something of a carpetbagger, but moved to Hickory and gained the respect of a lot of people. I mean, he ended up being a judge in Catawba County, and Thornton partnered with him. He had stature in the community of one sort or another.
Well, just my opinion, he's one of the most interesting characters that I've come across in local history. And one thing I would say is if it happened before World War II, most people don't know about it. And you really have to go dig for it to find out what happened. And I think, this is definitely one of those cases.
Yeah, it's a fun story. He's not consequential. But the one thing I was going to say about him being a Civil War veteran was when there was a young African-American man who worked at the Hickory Inn that was killed by a white man from Alabama. Thornton as a lawyer, joined the prosecution to try to help convict the white owner. Now, when it went to the jury, they acquitted the guy. But on that side of the ledger, he was very progressive.
Let me ask you one other thing, and I hate to back up, but on the quail eating, was there such a thing as like a world record book, Guinness, or anything like that?
I don't think so, because it never gets mentioned.
So he was a trail setter, even at that, out there setting records where there were none before.
I think the newspapers were always looking for like a stunt like that, and I don't know how it got started. That he must have been bragging or something that I could eat 30 of those with no problem, and they said, "Okay, young fella, let's see it," and put him to the test.
But he rose to the occasion.
Yeah, and like you said, when they met, he must have been a charmer because she took to him, and she never divorced him.
Right.
She might have wanted to kill him, but she never divorced him.
Maybe. And she lived to be 88, so they were together a good while.
And they're together again because they're both buried over at Oakwood Cemetery. Both went to the Episcopal Church of the Ascension, which again follows the Schulers. He really seemed to have come to town to fulfill what Daniel Schuler couldn't. Now he didn't run a bank or anything, but he was a pretty well-known guy. And it's funny how in those papers you come across all these little stories that you don't think is much, but it really speaks volumes about him. He apparently had been drinking one night and got into a fight with a guy, and they took the case to mayor's court, which they used to have. The guy got so mad at him that he threw, I think he threw his cane or something at Marcellus, hit him in the head and caused a gash. And there was such a melee there that the mayor had to pull his pistol and shoot it to bring order back. So, I get from that he was something of a polarizing figure. You either loved him or you hated him. Yeah. It's been a fun thing to write.
It was very fun. It was very interesting to me. And so, that's the key. The takeaway for me is particularly women, but anybody who wants you want your story told, you better tell it. And you better leave it in a format that can be shared.
And this comes with its own cliffhanger. And I will say this about his writing, that when in his novels, he was very good at making sure that when he ended a chapter, there was a reason for you to go to the next chapter. I don't know. It's like it's like a
That's
TV
what it's
show.
all about. Keep the reader reading.
Yeah, and he could. I mean, again, if you look at him as the person, the protagonist in all those books, he paints himself very, very well. He doesn't have a wife who is 20 years older than him in either of those books. Although in one of them, the second Lady of New Orleans, she's the one with the money. But she's young and fair, and they have children together, which he and Elizabeth did not. But if you think about her, she had husbands that spanned 60 years.
Her story is incredible when you think about it.
Oh, yeah.
It's just not out front.
Yeah.
Right. It's just sort of, and we tried to weave in little things throughout. I mean, you can't write a whole book about her, but you can certainly surmise from events that happened, okay, she would have been this kind of lady. And so it's been very fun.
Yeah. I guess we're going to have our own cliffhanger when we talk about her death and what that meant for him, huh?
Yeah, you'll have to find out when you read the book.
Yeah.
That's right. That'll keep you reading.
Yeah, to me, that's probably the weirdest and best ending to her life, even though she would no longer be there to see it happen. That comes as part of this.
Poetic justice.
I guess so, yeah. I'm sure he didn't think so. Yeah. So that gives you an idea of what this whole thing is, but Claudia's right. Take a tour of the Harper House and you can see the Thornton's influence on there. But he's, like you say, before World War II, if something happened.
Nobody knows about it.
Yeah. There was a whole other era in Hickory that does not see the light of day anymore. And maybe it's because it was crowded with so many things happening after the war that they just didn't have, it was a sea change. Because, when she'd go around Hickory, she'd go around in a couple of horses and a carriage, which is, so foreign to what we do today.
And her wealth, I mean, if you could gauge the amount of money that she had, I mean, did anyone else in Hickory have that much money at the time? There's no way.
No woman. I guess the Shufords, A.A. Shuford, was building his cotton mills and that sort of thing. He and maybe the Abernethys would have been like the only real rival to her, because he was amassing his fortune,
right.
And that sort of thing. And actually, there was connections between them because when Thornton restarted the power company, he worked a deal to supply power to A.A. Shuford's cotton mill. They would have known each other. As he got older, he would go to the city council meetings and say, "I'm going to buy back the power company," and everybody knew they were going to buy back the power company. But it's a nice way to, that they indulged him. Let's put it that way. So, if you want a copy of the book, since Robert's not here, I feel duty bound to say this: RedHawkPublications.com and get your copy, because it's fun, and who knows where this story is going from here. I got ideas, but I got to get everybody else on board. But thank you. I appreciate my wife being here, and we live to tell about it, so we're doing all right.
Hey, thank you, Tim.
Oh, hey, point for both of you.
Okay, this marriage counseling session is considered a success.
It is complete.
Only one thing we got left to do. The name of this program is RedPubPod. Can you say that?
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod. Whoops.
And you're a regular on this.
I know.
Want to give it another
I
shot?
got what's the name again?
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
Say that 3 times fast.
Well, that's the trick. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been
RedPubPod. RedPubPod. RedPubPod.
a podcast from Red Hawk Publications.
What's the name again?
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.